Okay, so we're here the next morning. It's about 6:05 in the morning, and we're ready to start mixing up some bread. So here I've got my sourdough starter, and as promised, it doubled in size. So it's looking nice and healthy. It doesn't really have a peak on it, doesn't really have a valley on it. So that tells me it's right about where it should be. You don't want it to deflate too much, then you know you've passed your prime, but as long as it's doubled in size and is right around that, you're good to go. So I love these mason jars. I also do a 2% salt, so this is 20 grams of salt to 100 grams of flour. I like to use a really nice sea salt, nice and fine, so it blends up a lot better. Do not use iodized salt, do not use any kind of flavored salt, it's just not going to turn out right. Some folks use up to 2.5% on their salt, but I always like to put in 2%. That way, if I want to dash a little bit of salt on with some butter, I don't feel so bad about it. But yeah, we've got those. I forgot to mention in my last video, cover up your autolyse overnight. I just use an upside down bowl, and then I just keep, or upside down plate. I keep reusing this over and over and over again as I do my stretch and folds. So, yeah, here's our autolyse dough, and you can see now just how much gluten is already developed in it. So, wasn't able to do that at all yesterday. It was just a shaggy mess, but just by leaving it alone for, what was that, about 9 hours? It's just really, really happy. So what we're gonna do is grab my trusty scale, zero it out, and then we're gonna add in 200 grams of starter. Remember, I have around 210 grams in here, so I know I can really scoop a lot of this out before I have to start going slow. It's about 193 now. As promised, I will get my hands dirty, because there's no avoiding it here. So I'm at 202 there. Again, I'm not going to be super precise. The one thing I am super precise on is my salt. So I'm going to get my hands a little wet. I like to spread this out. Kind of cover up the whole entire top. I'm going to move my out of the way there. All right. And then, now that I've got this, I'm just going to sprinkle this over. And then what I like to do is just kind of punch it in with my fingers. I'm kind of just clawing it in there. I'm hoping to incorporate the salt into all of the dough. I love that fine sea salt because I really feel like as soon as it hits the water that's inherent in the dough, it just automatically goes away. I've tried to use kosher salt before. It just always feels like it's still in there. I get pretty, not obsessed, but I do like to have a good fine salt in there. I've been known to blend salt up before. All right, so this is looking pretty darn good. And now what we're gonna do is just start to incorporate it. So with one hand, usually I'm turning the bowl around. And all I'm doing right now is just picking it up and pushing it back down. And this is one of the methods I like to use. Excuse me. It's one of the methods I like to use. I use a couple different methods to incorporate. So you're like, hey, this looks great. And actually, no, all I did was just put the sourdough starter right in the middle of all this. So this is kind of like a modified stretch and fold, if you will. But the one that I really like to do to really get it going, because you saw how elastic and it was before, now it doesn't want to do anything because I started messing with it. So the way to kind of loosen it up is by picking it up. I've got my fingers like this. I'm picking it up and bringing it back down. You can kind of hear it makes a funny little noise. And now it's stretchy again. It's so interesting how it does that. And anytime it ever gets tight, it's called the rhubarb method. and just do a little rhubarb to it. And now we've already built a lot of the gluten strength through the autolyse, so there's not a lot of strengthening that we're trying to do. This rhubarb actually mixes it up. That slapping noise puts air into it, which means bubbles in your bread. Always what I'm looking for. I don't like a super tight crumb. I like bubbles in my bread. And then I'm colorblind, as most of you know, so this part gets a little bit tricky for me, but I do know that my sourdough starter is darker than my flour was, because it's got more whole wheat in it. And so really what I'm trying to do now is just incorporate this all together so that I don't see, like, this is all starter right here. I don't want that. I want it to be all homogeneous in here. And so I'm doing a pretty good job of keeping this hand clean, but this hand, lovely, very dirty. The one thing I forgot to mention yesterday as well is the importance of filtered water. Filtered water is so important. You shouldn't be using water right out of your tap. Most water out of the tap has chlorine or a chlorine substitute in it. Chlorine is in your water to kill things that are in water, such as yeast, such as bacteria, such as what's in your sourdough starter. So if you're not using filtered water, I highly recommend using filtered water. Now, if you don't have filtered water, you can buy bottled water. I try not to buy bottled water, so the tip that I know from beer making is to take some water, put it in some sort of vessel you don't use a lot. Like if you have an old water jug laying around, an old juice pitcher that you don't use anymore, just take your tap water, fill it up, and let it sit at least one night. And you can cover it loosely, but all you're doing is allowing the chlorine or the chlorine substitute, the name is, I'm spacing on it right now. We use it here in Tahoe, and I can smell it in non-filtered water because we use filtered water here at our house. But all it's doing is allowing it to off-gas, because chlorine will off-gas just like any other kind of bleach. It will just naturally dissipate out of the water. You don't even have to stir it. It just wants to rise up and leave the water. So I used to do that when I brewed beer, and it allowed it to taste a lot better, because you can make some funky beer if you're using chlorinated water. And I've never used unfiltered water for my bread, so I wouldn't even know what the results were like. All I can tell you is I have experience from brewing beer, and yeast does not like chlorine. So we have amazing water here in Tahoe. It's some of the purest around, but they still put a substitute in to kill anything that might enter the system, some sort of chlorine substitute. And then we have a house built in 1960 with pipes from 1960. So our pipes are pretty rusted out. So a few years back, we got what's called a water chef, just plugs right into the water line. A filter cost around 65, 70 bucks on Amazon. And it lasts for about 10 months. And it makes the water taste amazing. And when I change the filter is brown with rust. So that's how I know it's doing its job. It makes our water taste like what Tahoe Tap should taste like. So it's really coming along. I can do this up to 5 minutes. It's really about that color and the blend of the two colors. That lighter flour that I had, the darker sourdough starter that I had. Because after all of this, I will go through a series of stretch and folds. And there's a lot of different ways to build a gluten strength in your dough, because that's really what we're focused on here. Is we did the autolyse, and that does build a ton of gluten strength. The stretch and fold does a ton of gluten strength. You can see here, I'm just kind of doing a pickup and a couple tugs, and then pushing it into the dough so that it keeps the fold. But some people do a coil fold, some people do stretch and fold. This is an old, awesome Pyrex bowl. I just love it. It makes 2 loaves of bread real easy. So I like the stretch and fold. And I'll just show you what that is. It's basically just pick it up, bring it over, push it down, turn the bowl, and it's all about making your hand into a scoop. Too many people try to do this. You're really trying to extend the dough. And you'll learn that feel of what that feels like. And you don't ever want to pull it until it tears, but the way that I incorporate my dough is just through stretch and fold, because it's just an easy method to do it. I've seen people try to get in here with a mixing spoon or something crazy, and it just never seems to work. It looks really uncomfortable. I find that the KitchenAid ends up making the dough too tough, beats all the air out of it, and that's not what we want to do. We want to put air into it. So I don't recommend using a stand mixer. Plus with a stand mixer, I could only ever get it up to around 700 grams of flour, so I was making 2 small loaves, and I like a 500 gram loaf. It's just a nice visually aesthetic size. So yeah, I think this is looking good. It's looking pretty darn incorporated. It's back to looking silky again like it did when we opened the lid. So now what I do is I just finish off with some rhubarb. So what I'm going to do is just 15 to 20, move it 15 to 20, 15 to 20, and I'm just reincorporating the air back in that I may have taken out. And then I'll go ahead and cover it. And then after I cover it, I'll let it sit for half an hour. And then every half an hour, I'll do a stretch and fold for it. And then that stretch and fold, what I'm looking for is what's called a window pane test. So you can see this almost wants to do it, but it breaks at the last minute. But I'm pulling it and I'm stretching it. And when it's right, I'll be able to tell because it won't break on me. It'll stay together. And it looks like you can see through it like a window pane. And that's when you know your gluten is totally properly developed. So I just like to tip the bowl on its side. Get a little bit there. I'm really looking for that slapping sound. As you can see how it just is all one homogeneous dough, which is awesome. And this is dough that once it is ready, I'm not even going to bake it today. I'm going to put it back in the fridge, and I'll explain that in the next video. Because I won't even bake. Today is Tuesday. This bed won't break till, this bread will not bake until Thursday. Get my coffee. All right, I'd say that looks pretty good, right? You don't see any spots or where the starter is still at. It's all incorporated. Plus we'll do more stretch and folds to further incorporate. So this is ready to go. Go ahead and put this back on, set a timer for half an hour, and come back and do a stretch and fold.